Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Your support helps me bring you even more amazing stories. The memory of the crash doesn't come to me in pictures anymore. It comes in sounds. It's the rhythmic thump-thump of tires on a rain-slicked highway, followed by the sudden, violent screech that sounded like the scream of a dying animal. Then the crunch of metal, the sound of a soda can being crushed by a giant's heel. And finally, the silence. A silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing the oxygen right out of my 6-year-old lungs. My name was Elena. I was born into a world of vibrant colors, soft edges, and the unconditional warmth of two people who loved me more than they loved themselves. In a single Tuesday evening, that world was liquidated. My parents were gone before the first ambulance reached the scene. I remember that temporary shelter. It was a place of beige walls and the overwhelming, suffocating scent of institutional floor wax, a smell that tried and failed to mask the scent of neglected children and unwashed fear. I sat on a blue plastic chair for 3 days, my legs swinging, waiting for a face I recognized to walk through the heavy oak doors. On the second day, my father's brother, Uncle Julian, appeared. He didn't come to me. He stood by the social worker's desk, his eyes darting toward the exit as if he were afraid the tragedy might be contagious. "We have a 2-bedroom, I heard him whisper, his voice thin and defensive. "And Sarah is already 5 months along. We're stretched thin as it is. The mortgage is up for renewal and the economy, well, it's just not the right time. Surely the state has a program for these things. A trust?" He left without saying goodbye. He didn't even look at me. In his mind, I was already a bad debt, a liability that would unbalance his carefully curated life. Then there was Aunt Linda. She sent a stuffed bear with a missing eye and a card with a $10 bill taped inside. She called once, sobbing so hysterically the social worker had to hang up. She promised to visit as soon as her nerves settled. Her nerves never settled. On the 4th day, the silence of the hallway was shattered, not by a scream or a cry, but the rhythmic, authoritative click-clack of high heels on the linoleum. It was a sound of purpose, a sound of an audit in progress. Martha Vance didn't look like anyone's idea of a grandmother. She was 62 then, her silver hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to sharpen her features into a blade. She wore a charcoal wool suit, even in the humid October heat, and carried a black leather briefcase that looked like it held the secrets of a small nation. She didn't go to the social worker. She walked straight to me. She knelt, her knees cracking like the sound of a dry twig, and looked me directly in the eye. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't offer a platitude about angels in heaven. She held out a small leather-bound notebook and a heavy fountain pen. "Elena," she said, her voice like velvet stretched over gravel, "in this world, people will try to tell you that you are a liability. They will try to write you off the moment your value isn't obvious to them. But look at me. From this moment on, you and I are a closed system. We balance our own books. Mi sami svodim debit creditum. Do you understand?" I didn't, really, but I took her hand. Her skin was dry and smelled of old paper, lavender, and the metallic tang of ink. She stood up, turned to the social worker, and handed over a folder of documents so thick it hit the desk with a heavy thud that echoed through the room. "I have the power of attorney, the audited bank statements, and character references from the board of directors," Martha said, her voice cutting through the social worker's stammered excuses. "The girl is coming with me. Don't bother with the follow-up calls. I've already reviewed your department's efficiency ratings for the last quarter. You're behind schedule. Focus on the others. Elena is now an off-balance sheet asset." We left that day in a taxi that smelled of old tobacco and rainy pavement. As we drove away from the shelter, I looked out the back window. I realized that my life had just been saved by a woman who treated love like a high-stakes financial transaction, and for the next 18 years, Martha Vance would teach me the language of survival. Martha was the senior chief accountant for the city's largest manufacturing plant.
To the world, she was a woman of numbers, a cold machine who could find a missing kopeck in a billion-dollar ledger within seconds. To me, she was a philosopher of the tangible. Elena, she would say, during our Saturday morning audits, which is what we called our breakfast together, life is a double-entry ledger. For every joy you experience, there is a hidden cost. For every debt you owe, there must be a settlement. Most people fail because they forget to account for the interest. They spend their hearts on people who have no capital. She taught me to read a balance sheet before she taught me to read poetry. By age 10, I knew how to spot a fraudulent expense report by looking for the subtle jitter in the ink. By age 15, I understood that unforeseen circumstances was just a weak man's excuse for poor planning. But her most important lessons were about people. She viewed human relationships through the lens of forensic accounting. "Audit your friends, Elena," she'd say, her spectacles reflecting the blue light of her desk lamp as she worked late into the night. "Some are assets. They appreciate over time, adding value to your soul. They are the ones who stay when the market crashes. But most are liabilities. They consume your energy, drain your emotional reserves, and leave you bankrupt when the first sign of rain hits the window. Learn to write off the liabilities early. It's the only way to stay in the black." She told me the story of my grandfather, Nicholas, only once. I knew him from a single faded photograph hidden in the back of an old ledger. A man with a movie star smile and eyes that seemed to be constantly searching for the nearest exit. He was a masterpiece of marketing, Martha told me, her voice devoid of the usual sharpness, replaced with a cold, analytical clarity that was far scarier. He sold me a dream of a life that didn't exist. He used his charm to bypass my internal controls. Then, after 12 years of marriage, he liquidated our savings and ran off with a girl who was the age you are now. But he didn't stop there. He spent 20 years trying to sue me for this very apartment. He didn't want the memories. He wanted the equity I had built with my own sweat while he was out finding himself. He didn't want the woman. He wanted the asset. She had won that war, not through shouting or tears, but through a superior paper trail. She had kept every receipt, every canceled check, every recorded whisper of his infidelity. I defeated him with no anger, Elena. Anger is volatile. It's a bad investment. I defeated him with documentation. Documents are permanent. They are the only truth the world respects. I grew up in that fortress of silver and ink, believing I was prepared for anything. I believed I had Martha's internal audit system installed in my heart, a firewall against the world's predators. But then I met Mark.
I met Mark when I was 24, at a corporate mixer I hadn't even wanted to attend. I thought I was armed. I thought I knew the signs. But Mark didn't come at me with poetry or the flashy, reckless charm of my grandfather. He came at me with plans. He was a project manager for a high-rise construction firm, a builder. He was 30, handsome in a rugged, safe way that felt like a foundation. On our third date, he didn't bring roses. He brought a printed 5-year plan for his career, laid out in a neat professional font. "I don't just want a girlfriend, Elena," he said, his voice warm and sincere in the candlelit corner of the bistro. "I want a partner, a co-investor, someone to build a kingdom with. I've seen your work at the firm. You have a mind for the details that most men in my industry lack. Together, we'd be unstoppable. We could be the ultimate hedge against the world." For the first time in my life, I felt a thrill that wasn't born of caution. Someone wasn't looking at me as a burden to be housed or a girl to be protected. He was looking at me as an equal, a partner in a grand enterprise. I felt my internal firewall begin to flicker. When I finally brought him home to meet Martha, the atmosphere in the apartment changed instantly. The air felt thin, charged with a silent, high-frequency tension. Martha had prepared a roast, her movements slow but as precise as ever. She was 75 now, her silver hair turned to a stark, beautiful white, but her eyes were still two twin lasers of scrutiny. Mark was a virtuoso. He didn't talk about himself, he talked about structural integrity, capital appreciation, and long-term dividends. He laughed at Martha's dry, accounting-based jokes and even helped her clear the table with a deference that looked exactly like respect. But Martha had a way of creating stress tests. She intentionally left the room to find a specific tea strainer, leaving them alone for exactly 3 minutes. I was in the kitchen, but I stopped by the doorway, a view they didn't know I had. Mark wasn't looking at Martha. He wasn't even looking at the tea. He was standing by the large window in the living room, his back to her. He was tapping the glass with a knuckle, checking the seal. Then he looked up at the ceiling, his eyes tracing the line of the ornate crown molding. He stepped to the side, looking at the hallway, his lips moving silently as if he were calculating square footage. It was a look I would later call the buyer's gaze. When he left that night, I was floating on a cloud of validation. Grandma, he's perfect. He understands everything you taught me. He's a builder. He's an asset. Martha was sitting in her high-backed armchair, her hands resting on the polished wood handles. She looked tired, older than she had that morning. The light of the floor lamp cast deep shadows across her face. "He is a builder, Elena," she said softly, her voice holding a weight that dampened my joy. "But he isn't building a kingdom for you. He's surveying a site. He looked at the plumbing under the guest sink when I was pouring the wine. He checked the fuse box when he went to wash his hands. He isn't in love with you, child. He is in love with the potential of your inheritance." "That's unfair," I snapped, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "You're just looking for a reason to write him off because of what Grandpa did. You're cynical, Martha. Mark is different. He's modern. He has a plan for us." Martha looked at me with a profound, aching sadness. "I hope I'm wrong, Elena. Truly, I would love to be the fool in this scenario. But I've 50 years swodila balansi, and Mark's numbers don't add up to love. They add up to a hostile takeover. He doesn't want a partner. He wants a title deed." I ignored her. I chose to believe in the plan. I married him 6 months later in a ceremony that Mark designed to be efficient yet elegant. Martha attended in a deep navy wool suit, her back straight as a spear, her eyes never leaving the audit mode. The first year was what Mark called the grace period. He was attentive, hardworking, and seemingly devoted. But slowly, the maintenance costs of our marriage began to rise, and the "we" he spoke of began to feel more and more like a him. "We should probably consolidate our accounts, Elena," he said, casually tossing a bank form onto the table. "It's more efficient. It allows for better capital deployment for the 5-year plan. Why keep separate ledgers when we're one firm?" I hesitated, remembering Martha's voice about internal controls, but I wanted to show him I trusted him. I signed. Then came the subtle, clinical isolation. "Your grandmother's getting older, honey. Her talk about audits and debts, it's depressing. It's affecting your productivity at work. Maybe we should limit our visits to once a week for your mental health. We need to stay focused on the future, not her past." But the real decay, the true liquidity crisis, began when Mark's construction firm hit a wall. A massive project fell through, the owners were found to be over-leveraged, and the company vanished overnight. Mark was suddenly out of work. The man who had a 5-year plan suddenly couldn't plan for the next 24 hours. He didn't look for a new job with the same energy he used to survey our apartment. Instead, he stayed home, pacing the rooms like a caged animal, his eyes fixed on the walls. "This place is worth a fortune," he'd mutter, his voice dark and obsessive, while Martha slept in the next room. "If we sold this, I could seed my own firm. We could be the owners, Elena, not the employees. Why are we letting an old woman's sentimental attachment to bricks and mortar keep us in poverty?" "It's Martha's home, Mark," I'd say, my heart sinking as I saw the buyer's haze become a permanent fixture on his face. "She's lived here for 50 years. She's 90. She deserves to die in her own bed." "She's an old woman," he'd bark, his mask of the safe builder shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces.
She's sitting on a gold mine and we're starving in the tunnels. It's bad business, Elena. It's a waste of assets. A good accountant knows when to liquidate a stagnant position." He began a campaign of psychological gaslighting. He would tell me I was too emotional to understand the market. He would tell me Martha was senile and that her constant talk of ledgers was a sign of late-stage dementia. He even tried to convince Martha to sign a power of attorney over to us. I'll never forget that afternoon. I came home early to find Mark sitting by Martha's bed. He was holding a pen and a clipboard, his voice a sickeningly sweet parody of concern. "It's just to help with the bills, honey. Elena's so stressed. She's losing hair over the stress. Let us take the burden. You've earned a rest. Just a signature and the audit is done." Martha was lying there, her eyes half closed, but as I walked in, she looked at me. There was a spark in her eyes, the old cold fire of the senior chief accountant. "Mark," she said, her voice thin but as sharp as a scalpel, "I've audited the books of men much smarter and much more dangerous than you. You're currently carrying a deficit of character that no amount of real estate can ever cover. Get out of my room before I call the security I've already prepaid for." Mark's face went a mottled, violent purple. He stormed out, brushing past me without a word. That was the day the war became overt.
Martha began to die that winter. It wasn't a sudden crash, not a dramatic bankruptcy of the heart. It was a slow, agonizing depreciation of her physical reserves. The silver in her hair seemed to lose its luster, turning to a brittle white that reminded me of frost on a window pane. The apartment, once a fortress of cinnamon and order, began to smell of sterile antiseptic and the metallic tang of old age. I became her nurse, her cook, and her shield. I spent my nights sitting by her bed, the light of her desk lamp casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of ledgers that she insisted on keeping near her. Mark, meanwhile, became a ghost in the house, a predatory ghost. He didn't offer to help. He didn't bring her soup. He spent his time in the living room, nursing glasses of cheap scotch and staring at the walls with a look of hungry calculation. He was waiting for the heart to stop beating so he could claim the territory. He stopped looking at me entirely. His buyer's gaze was now focused solely on the real estate. "Elena," Martha whispered one night, her hand clutching mine with a strength that surprised me. Her fingers were cold, like marble, but her grip was the grip of someone who wasn't finished with the world. "He thinks the ledger is closed. He thinks he's won because I can no longer stand to audit his lies. But a good accountant always has an off-balance sheet reserve. She always has a contingency fund for the day the vultures arrive." "Don't worry about him, Grandma," I sobbed, my tears falling onto the dry skin of her hand. "Just focus on breathing. Just focus on the next minute." "Listen to me," she said, her eyes pinning me to the spot with a fierce, lucid intensity. "The world is full of men who think a woman's kindness is an unsecured loan. They think they can default on the debt of love and still keep the house. Tomorrow, a man named Simon will call you. He will say he is from the Historical Records Office. Go to him. Don't tell Mark. Don't tell anyone. This is the final entry, Elena. Ensure the columns are straight." I didn't understand what she meant. I thought her mind was finally starting to drift into the fog of dementia that Mark had been predicting, but I promised her anyway, just to see the tension leave her shoulders. Martha Vance passed away 3 days later. It was a cold, gray Thursday morning. The rain was turning to sleet, rattling against the glass like a handful of gravel. She died with her oldest ledger book resting on her chest, her hand placed firmly on the final, empty page, as if she were guarding the conclusion of her story. The funeral was a performance of the highest order. Mark was the devastated grandson-in-law. He wore a black suit that fit him perfectly, his expression a masterpiece of somber grief. He shook hands with the gray-faced men from the factory who had come to pay their respects to the woman who had kept their pensions safe for 40 years. He even shed a few calculated tears as the casket was lowered into the frozen earth.
but as the first shovelful of dirt hit the wood with a hollow thud, I saw him lean over to a man in a sharp, slate-gray coat. I recognized the man from the flyers that had been appearing in our mailbox. He was the city's top real estate liquidator, a man known for moving distressed properties with clinical speed. Mark wasn't mourning a grandmother, he was closing a deal. We hadn't even been back from the cemetery for 2 hours when the storm finally broke. The sleet had turned back into a relentless, freezing rain that made the world outside look like a charcoal sketch. Inside, the apartment felt cavernous and cold, the heat seemingly having died with Martha. I was sitting on the sofa, still wearing my black wool coat, clutching Martha's old knitted shawl. The scent of her, lavender and ink, was still trapped in the wool, a ghost of the only person who had ever truly seen me. Mark walked into the room. He wasn't wearing his mourning face anymore. The somber mask had been discarded in the hallway along with his umbrella. He looked energized, his eyes bright with the fever of a project manager about to break ground. "Okay," he tossed a thick manila folder on the mahogany coffee table. "I've already had the preliminary appraisal done. Given the current market and the proximity to the new transit hub, we can list for $1.4 million. If we push for an as-is cash sale to one of my developers, we can have the funds in escrow by the end of the month. We can be out of this hoe box by the weekend." I looked at the folder. The bold text on the cover read, "Liquidation Strategy." "Mark," my voice was a whisper, a sound of pure exhaustion. "My grandmother was buried 4 hours ago. Her bed is still warm. How can you even think about this right now?" "Because the clock is ticking on the property taxes, Elena," he snapped, his voice echoing in the empty room. "Don't be a sentimental child. We have debts. I have a firm to start. I've already scouted the office space. This apartment is our seed money. It's our capital. We're moving to the Hilton on Saturday while we scout for the new house. I've already contacted the movers." "I'm not selling," I said. It wasn't a shout. It was a cold, hard statement of fact. Mark stopped mid-pace. He turned to me, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He walked over to the sofa and leaned down until his face was inches from me. I could smell the scotch on his breath, the expensive bottle he'd taken from Martha's private cabinet. "You don't have a choice, Elena," he hissed. "I've spent 5 years auditing your life. I've spoken to my lawyer. As your husband, and since this apartment was inherited while we were married, I have marital equity. And since you have no income of your own, since you've been playing nurse for a year, I am the primary conservator of our financial interests. You're going to sign the papers, Elena, or I will have you declared mentally unfit by the end of the week. The grief has clearly broken you. You're a liability to yourself." "Mark, please." I felt the old habit of submission clawing at my throat. "I'm done with the please," he roared. He turned and grabbed a suitcase from the hallway, the brown leather one I had used for visiting my parents' graves. He began throwing my clothes into it with a violent, rhythmic efficiency. "What are you doing?" I jumped up, the shawl falling to the floor. "I'm liquidating the liability," he yelled back, his eyes wild with a terrifying cold light. "You want to cling to this moldy old tomb? Fine, cling to it from the sidewalk. I'm changing the locks in the morning. You can come back when you've found a pen and a shred of common sense. Go to your historical records office, Elena. See if they have a record of a woman who wasn't a total failure." He grabbed me by the arm, his grip so tight I knew it would leave bruises. He dragged me to the door, threw my suitcase into the dark, wet hallway, and shoved me after it. "Don't come back until you're ready to be a partner instead of a weight." The door slammed shut. The deadbolt, the one that Martha had installed to keep the world out, clicked shut with a sound of finality. I sat on my suitcase in the dark, damp hallway. The flickering light overhead buzzed like a trapped insect. I was 26 years old. I had $40 in my purse. I had no family, and my husband had just successfully audited me out of my own life. I put my head in my hands and listened to the rain. I felt small, so small that I thought the shadows of the hallway might just swallow me whole. But then I heard it. The heavy door at the bottom of the stairs opened. Then the rhythmic metallic clink-clink of heavy footsteps on the stairs. It was a sound of purpose, a sound I hadn't heard since the day Martha Vance walked into the children's shelter 20 years ago. I looked up. A man was standing at the top of the flight. He was in his 50s, wearing a charcoal gray trench coat that looked like it was tailored for a soldier. He carried a heavy leather briefcase with silver buckles. "Elena Vance?" he asked. His voice was calm, resonant, and entirely devoid of the buyer's gaze. "I don't have anything left," I whispered, my tears mixing with the grime on my face. "If you're here to collect a debt, you're at the wrong door." "I am here to collect a debt," the man said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a small, leather-bound notebook, the exact twin of the one Martha had given me when I was 6, "but not from you. My name is Simon. I am the executor of the Vance private ledger. Your grandmother told me to expect you on these stairs. She said the liabilities always discard the assets when the rain starts. She said it was the most predictable transaction in human history." I blinked, my tears mixing with the grime on my face. She knew? She knew he would throw me out? Martha Vance was a senior chief accountant, Elena. She didn't guess. She calculated the risk and built a firewall. "Please, my car is outside. We have a midnight audit to attend, and I believe you'll find the closing balance very illuminating."
The interior of the black SUV was a sanctuary of climate-controlled silence and the scent of expensive, hand-stitched leather. As Simon pulled away from the curb, the rain transformed from a hostile force into a mere background texture, blurring the neon signs of the city into streaks of watercolor gold. Simon didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. He handed me a thermos of tea. It was Earl Grey, exactly the way Martha liked it, with a hint of honey and no milk. The warmth seeped through my frozen fingers, and for the first time in hours, the frantic buzzing in my brain began to quiet. "I imagine you have many questions, Elena," Simon said, his eyes fixed on the road. But Martha was very specific. She said, "The girl needs to see the ledger before she understands the logic. We are going to the city office of the Sterling and Thorne firm. We're meeting the one person Martha trusted more than her own heart." "Who?" I whispered. "Clara Thorne, the woman who notarized every major transaction in this city for 40 years, and the woman who helped your grandmother build her firewall." We pulled up to a sleek, modern building in the financial district, a tower of glass and light that felt like the heart of the world's machinery. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of marble. We bypassed the security desk. Simon had a keycard that whispered of high-level clearance. Clara Thorne's office was on the 40th floor. It was a room filled with the smell of old mahogany and the low, constant hum of high-end servers. Clara herself was a woman who looked like she was made of parchment and steel. She was in her late 60s, wearing a tailored navy suit, her eyes sharp behind silver-rimmed spectacles. "Elena," she said, rising from her desk. She didn't offer a hug, she offered a seat. "Martha told me you'd have her eyes tonight, the eyes of someone who has finally seen the bottom of the ledger and realized the numbers don't lie." She opened a massive blue-bound folder. It was thick with legal seals and stamps that looked like they carried the weight of a century. "Martha Vance came to me the day after you married Mark Thorne. She sat in that very chair, and she told me, 'Clara, my granddaughter has just invested her heart in a high-risk, low-yield asset. We need to restructure her holdings immediately.'" "What does that mean?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "It means that 3 years ago, on the day of your wedding, while you were dancing at the reception, Martha was in this office executing a deed of gift inter vivos. She didn't leave you the apartment in a will, Elena. A will is a vulnerable document. It can be contested in probate. It can be dragged through years of litigation. And in this jurisdiction, it can sometimes be argued as marital property if not structured correctly." Clara leaned forward, the light reflecting off her glasses. "But a deed of gift? That is an immediate transfer of title while the donor is still alive. 3 years ago, Martha Vance ceased to be the owner of that apartment. You became the sole legal title holder. Martha remained as a life tenant, but the asset has been yours, and yours alone, since the day you said, "I do." The room seemed to tilt. She gave it to me then? Why didn't she tell me? Because she knew Mark, Simon said from the corner of the room. She had audited his character during that first dinner. She knew that if he found out you already owned the property, he would have spent every waking hour gaslighting you, pressuring you to put his name on the deed, or forcing you to sell it to seed his imaginary firm. Martha knew that the only way to protect the asset was to keep it off book until the moment of the hostile takeover. Clara pushed another document toward me. It was a deed for a property I'd never heard of. "And then there is Ozyorny," Clara said softly. "Your great-aunt Zenaida died 10 years ago. She was a woman of secrets, much like Martha. She left your grandmother a sprawling timber estate, 15 acres of prime forest, and a house built of ancient cedar. Martha never spoke of it because she wanted it to be your black box reserve, a place where the world could never find you unless you wanted to be found. She spent 10 years paying the taxes in secret," Simon added. "She used the consulting fees she earned from auditing the city's private firms, money Mark never knew existed. He thought she was a pensioner. In reality, she was one of the highest-paid forensic accountants in the country until the day she couldn't walk anymore." But the final reveal was the one that destroyed the last of my weakness. Clara turned on a small, high-definition monitor on her desk. She said, "Martha recorded this 4 months ago. She said, 'Give this to Elena when the rain starts.'" The screen flickered to life. It was Martha. She was sitting in her bedroom, the light of the setting sun hitting her silver hair. She looked fragile, but her eyes were the twin fires of the senior chief accountant. "Elena," the video Martha said, and the sound of her voice made me gasp. "If you are watching this, it means you are sitting in Clara's office, feeling like the world has liquidated you. It means that man, the builder who only knows how to tear things down, has shown you his true heart. Do not cry for him, child. A bad debt does not deserve your tears. It deserves to be written off." She leaned closer to the camera, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "I have spent 18 years teaching you the language of numbers so that you would recognize a deficit when you saw one. Mark is a deficit. He is a character bankruptcy waiting to happen. I have built a wall of silver and ink around you. The apartment is yours. The money in the Vance Trust is yours. And Ozyorny is your sanctuary." She paused, her expression softening into a look of pure, unadulterated love. "Never pity a man who treats your kindness as a transaction, Elena. He thinks he's a project manager. Tonight, we show him what a real auditor looks like. Take the papers, take the power, and never let the columns be crooked again. I love you, little asset. Balance the books." The screen went black. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the 40th floor pressing in on me. I felt a transformation beginning in my marrow. The emotional girl Mark had tried to crush was being overwritten by the woman Martha had raised. I felt the weight of the iron ledgers in my soul. "What do we do now?" I asked. My voice was no longer a whisper. It was cold. It was precise. It was a blade. Simon stepped forward, a sharp, professional smile on his face. "We have a police escort waiting at the precinct, and a locksmith who specializes in high-security Vance spec locks. Your husband is currently in a property he does not own, having committed a criminal illegal eviction against the sole title holder. Would you like to go home and settle the account, Elena?" I stood up. I didn't feel the cold of my wet clothes anymore. I felt the heat of a looming settlement. "Yes," I said, "let's go perform the final audit."
The drive back to the apartment felt like a funeral procession, but not for Martha. This was the funeral of the man I had once thought I loved. The police cruiser followed Simon's SUV, its headlights cutting through the midnight gloom. Officer Miller sat in the front seat, a man who looked like he had seen everything the city had to throw at a person. He had reviewed the deed of gift and the title registry in the lobby of the precinct. His only comment had been, "Your grandmother was a hell of a strategist, Miss Vance. I wish more people balanced their lives like this." We pulled up to the brick building at 1:45 a.m. The street was deserted, the gutters rushing with rainwater. I looked up at the fourth floor. The lights were on in the living room, Martha's living room. A shadow moved across the window. Mark was in there, probably pacing the floor, already spending the $1.4 million in his head. "Stay behind me, Elena," Simon said as we stepped out into the rain. "The law is a shield, but sometimes the person holding the shield needs to be seen." We climbed the stairs. Each step felt lighter than the last. The weight, Mark had told me I was, seemed to have transferred to the air itself. We reached the fourth-floor landing. The brown suitcase, my life, according to Mark, was still leaning against the wall where he had thrown it. It looked lonely. It looked like a mistake that was about to be corrected. Officer Miller stepped forward and knocked. It wasn't the polite, questioning knock of a neighbor. It was the heavy, rhythmic pounding of the state. "Open up, police." The silence from inside the apartment was immediate. Then the sound of footsteps. The deadbolt, the one Mark thought it was his to control, threw its internal gears with a metallic clack. The door opened just a few inches, held by the security chain. Mark stood there, his hair disheveled, a glass of Martha's vintage cognac in his hand. He looked confused, his eyes darting from the uniform to Simon and finally to me. "Elena, what the hell is this?" His voice was a mixture of annoyance and a rising, jagged fear. "Officer, what's the problem? My wife is having a mental breakdown. I told her she could come back when she's calmed down, but—" "Step aside, sir," Officer Miller said, his voice a flat, professional drone. "We have documentation proving that Elena Vance is the sole, absolute title holder of this property. You, however, are not on the deed, nor are you a registered tenant. We have a report of a criminal illegal eviction. Open the door." Mark's face went a sickly, chalky white. "Sole owner? No, you're mistaken. This was her grandmother's. It's part of the estate. It's marital." "Open the door, Mr. Thorne," the officer repeated, his hand resting on his belt. Mark unhooked the chain. His hand was shaking so violently the cognac sloshed over the rim of the glass and onto his silk robe bob. We walked in. The apartment felt violated. Mark had already started staging it. He had moved Martha's favorite armchair toward the window. He had cleared her ledgers off the mahogany desk and replaced them with his own blueprints and a bottle of scotch. "This is a mistake," Mark yelled, turning to Simon. "Who the hell are you? I'm her husband. We have a 5-year plan. I have legal equity in everything she owns." Simon stepped into the center of the room, looking around with a clinical, detached air. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a certified copy of the deed of gift. "Mr. Thorne, you are suffering from a profound misunderstanding of the Vance ledger. 3 years ago, on the day of your wedding, Martha Vance executed an absolute transfer of this property to her granddaughter as a premarital gift. It was never part of her estate because she didn't own it when she died. And because it was a gift made to Elena alone, it carries 0 marital equity. You have been a guest in this house for 3 years, and your guest status was just revoked the moment you threw her suitcase into the hallway." No, she was senile," Mark screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the empty bedroom where Martha had died. "She didn't know what she was doing. I'll contest it. I'll sue for every penny." "You'll sue with what, Mark?" I asked. I walked over to the desk, Martha's desk. I felt the cool, solid wood under my fingers. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see a builder. I didn't see a partner. I saw a bad debt that had finally come due. "Your firm is bankrupt," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You have no assets, you have no income, and as of this moment, you have no home."
Simon has already filed the divorce papers, and since you have no equity in this property and no joint assets of any value, the court will be granting an immediate order of protection based on the events of tonight. My Elena, honey, he said, his voice dropping into that sickeningly sweet parody of love he used when he wanted something. I was just stressed. The funeral, it broke me. I didn't mean to push you. I was trying to protect our future. You know I love you. We're a team, remember? A team has two players, Mark. You've spent 5 years trying to play both sides of the ledger. You treated my grandmother like an obstacle and me like a line item. You didn't love me. You surveyed me. I looked at Officer Miller. I want him out, now. You heard the lady, Mr. Thorne. You have 10 minutes to gather your personal effects. Anything left behind will be considered abandoned and removed at your expense. The next 10 minutes were the most satisfying audit of my life. I watched the man who tried to liquidate me scramble through the rooms with 2 black garbage bags. He tried to grab Martha's silver clock, the one her father had given her in 1952. Put it down, I said. Mark froze. It's a family heirloom. It's worth... It's not your family, Mark. I cut him off. It's a Vance asset. You're a liability, and liabilities don't get to keep the silver. Out. He shoved his clothes into the bags, his face twisted in a mask of impotent rage. He tried to say something as he reached the landing, some final venomous curse to try and leave a mark, but Officer Miller just nudged him toward the landing. Move it, Thorne. The door shut. Simon stayed behind with the locksmith who had just arrived. Within 20 minutes, the old tumblers were replaced with high-security Vance spec steel. I stood in the center of the living room. The silence was no longer heavy. It was clean. I walked over to the desk and picked up the vintage cognac glass Mark had dropped. I poured the rest of it into the sink. Debt settled, I whispered. Simon walked over, handing me a final envelope. There is one more thing, Elena. Martha knew that even after the eviction, you wouldn't feel safe here for a while. The ghosts of Mark's plan are still in the walls. That's why Ozyorny is ready for you. The utilities are on, the fridge is stocked, and there is a car waiting in the garage downstairs. I looked at him. How did she know? How'd she know everything? She was a senior chief accountant, Elena. She knew that when you look at a balance sheet long enough, you can predict exactly when the market is going to crash. She just made sure you were the one holding the gold when it happened. I slept that night in Martha's bed. I didn't have nightmares. I dreamt of ink in silver, in the sound of high heels clicking on linoleum. The next morning, I packed my own suitcase, the brown one, but I didn't pack it with fear. I packed it with the ledgers, the iron key, and the deed of gift. I was going to Ozyorny. I was going to find the final ledger, and I was going to see what the Vance women had been building in the margins for 100 years.
The drive to Ozyorny took 4 hours, but it felt like a journey through time. As the steel and glass of the city dissolved into the rearview mirror, replaced by the jagged silhouettes of pine forests and the mist-shrouded peaks of the northern hills, I felt the city, Elena, beginning to shed like a winter coat. I was driving a silver SUV that had been waiting for me in the building's garage, another off-balance sheet reserve Martha had prepared. It was rugged, powerful, and handled the winding mountain roads with a mechanical confidence that mirrored my own rising resolve. Ozyorny wasn't just a village, it was a ghost of a settlement, a handful of timber houses tucked away where the forest met the edge of a deep glacial lake. The air here was different. It was sharp, oxygen-rich, and smelled of cedar resin and the cold, clean promise of snow. I found the estate at the very end of a gravel track that seemed to be swallowed by the trees. The house was a masterpiece of old-world engineering. It was built of massive, hand-hewn cedar logs, darkened by a century of mountain winters. A wide stone chimney rose like a spine along the eastern wall, and the porch, wraparound and deep, looked out over a lake that was as smooth and dark as a sheet of obsidian. I stepped out of the car. The silence was absolute, save for the wind soughing through the tops of the pines, a sound like the breath of the earth itself. I took the iron key from my pocket. It felt heavy, a physical manifestation of the inheritance I was only just beginning to understand. The lock turned with a smooth, oiled precision. Martha had been paying for the maintenance of this place for a decade, and it showed. The interior didn't smell like a musty, abandoned cabin. It smelled of beeswax, dry wood, and the faint, lingering scent of lavender. I walked through the rooms, my boots echoing on the wide, planked floors. It was a house built for survival and comfort. There was a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, a kitchen with a massive cast-iron stove, and a living room where the furniture was draped in heavy hand-woven linens. But I wasn't here for the furniture. I was here for the audit. I went to the master bedroom on the second floor. It was a spacious room with a balcony that overlooked the water. In the corner, under a heavy rug made of wool from a loom that had probably long since turned to dust, I found it. The floorboards were slightly mismatched. I knelt, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and used a small pry bar I had found in the kitchen. The board came up with a dry creak. Beneath sat a small fireproof safe. I used the code Simon had whispered to me before I left the city, the date of my parents' funeral. Martha had chosen it because she knew it was a number I could never forget, and a number Mark would never think to use because he viewed that day as my liquidation point, not my beginning. The safe opened with a soft hiss of pressurized air. Inside was a single, dusty notebook. It was bound in green leather, the edges frayed, the cover embossed with a simple silver V. This was it, the final ledger. I sat on the floor, the light of the setting sun casting a long, golden rectangle across the pages, and I began to read. It wasn't a book of numbers, it was a book of names. Zenaida Vance, Vera Vance, Martha Vance, Elena Vance. It was a diary, but written with the clinical precision of a forensic accountant. As I turned the pages, a history I had never known began to reconstruct itself in the margins. Zenaida hadn't just inherited this house. She and Martha had built the trust that funded it 40 years ago. They had been auditing the men in their lives long before I was born. I read about my grandfather, Nicholas. Martha had documented every one of his lies, not out of bitterness, but as a case study in risk management. She had recorded the exact moment he started stealing from their joint account, the exact day he met the other woman, and the exact sequence of legal maneuvers she used to trap him in his own greed. But then I found the entries about Zenaida's husband, a man named Boris, who I had been told died in a hunting accident. The ledger told a different story. Boris had been a gambler, a man who viewed his wife's inheritance as a pile of chips for the poker table. Zenaida hadn't waited for him to ruin her. She had liquidated the liability. She had moved her assets into Martha's name, staged a financial collapse that sent Boris running to his creditors, and then disappeared to this house in Ozyorny, where she lived out her life in the black, while Boris died in a debtor's prison in another country. The Vance women do not sleep in the rain. We build the roof while the sun is still shining. We keep the ledger because the world will always try to tell us we are in debt to them. We are not. The world is in debt to us for our silence, our labor, and our resilience. We settle the account when the time is right. I spent the entire night reading. I read about the Underground Railroad of Vance women. Martha hadn't just been a senior chief accountant, she had been the treasurer of a private society of women in the city. Teachers, nurses, clerks, who had all been writing off the liabilities in their lives. She had helped them hide money, secure titles, and build their own firewalls against men who viewed them as transactions. In the very back of the ledger, I found a letter addressed to me, dated only a week before Martha died. Elena. The ink was fresh here, the script slightly less steady but still clear. If you are reading this, it means you are sitting in the cedar room at Ozyorny. It means you have realized that the audit I taught you wasn't about tax returns or corporate fraud.
It was about freedom. Freedom is the only asset that truly appreciates. Mark was your final test. He was the ghost of Nicholas and the ghost of Boris. By standing on those stairs in the rain, you proved that you have the Vance marrow. You are the senior auditor now. The letter continued, outlining the Vance strategy. Inside this safe is a second key. It is for a safety deposit box in the city. Inside that box are the records of every private consulting job I did for the Thorne family's associates over 30 years. I knew Mark's firm was going to fail before he did. I knew his partners were embezzling from the pension fund. I have the receipts. I have the audit trail. If Mark ever tries to contest the deed of gift, if he ever tries to touch your peace, use the box. It is the nuclear option. It will not just ruin him, it will dismantle the entire Thorne lineage. I closed the notebook. The sun was rising over the lake, turning the obsidian water into a sheet of hammered silver. I looked at my hands. They were steady. My heart felt solid, a heavy, unbreakable piece of machinery. I wasn't just Elena the orphan. I wasn't Elena the victim of a construction manager's ego. I was the treasurer of the Vance legacy. I stood up and walked to the balcony. The forest was waking up, the birds beginning their morning chorus. I realized then that Martha hadn't just protected me from Mark, she had invited me into a lineage of forensic survivors. I looked back at the green leather book. There was one more page, an addendum written in Simon's hand. Mark Thorne attempted to break into the apartment 4 hours after his eviction. He was arrested for trespassing in violation of the protection order. He is currently being held without bail. His partners have filed a lawsuit against him for the loss of the firm's final assets. The liquidation is complete. He is in the red. I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips. Not a smile of joy, a smile of a balanced equation.
The legal battle that followed wasn't a battle at all. It was an execution. Mark Thorne, desperate and cornered, had hired a lawyer who specialized in aggressive marital dissolution. They sent me a 50-page summons claiming that the deed of gift was a fraudulent conveyance intended to deprive a husband of his rightful marital share. They claimed I had used undue influence on a senile woman to strip him of his future. They were demanding half the apartment's value, a portion of the Ozyorny estate, and a monthly maintenance allowance. They invited me to a mediation session at a high-end firm downtown. They expected me to show up trembling, ready to negotiate for my own life. I arrived with Simon. I wasn't wearing my old clerk's sweater. I was wearing Martha's navy wool suit, tailored to fit me like armor. I carried the black leather briefcase she had carried into the shelter 20 years ago. Mark sat across from me, his face a mask of bitter, desperate arrogance. He didn't look like a builder anymore. He looked like a man who had spent the last month realizing his 5-year plan had been written in disappearing ink. "Elena," he said, leaning over the table, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "Be reasonable. We can do this the hard way, and I'll drag your grandmother's name through the mud of every tabloid in this city. Or you can sign over 40% and walk away with your sanctuary in the woods. This is your last chance to liquidate before the crash." Simon didn't even look at the other lawyer. He looked at me and nodded. I opened the briefcase. I pulled out a single thin folder from the nuclear option box Martha had left in the city vault. "Mark," I said. My voice was calm, rhythmic, the sound of an auditor who has already found the missing kopeck. "I spent my youth learning that a man who sees a woman as a transaction will always seek a profit. But you forgot rule number 1 of the Vance ledger. Never attempt a hostile takeover of a firm that has a superior intelligence network." I pushed the folder across the table. "Inside this folder are the records of your firm's off-book transactions from 3 years ago, the ones where you and your partners diverted the labor insurance premiums into a shell company in the Caymans. I have the wire transfer numbers. I have the signatures. And I have the testimony of the internal auditor you fired, the one you thought was too emotional to understand the books." Mark's lawyer reached for the folder, but Mark's hand was faster. He grabbed it, his eyes scanning the first page. The color didn't just leave his face, it was as if his very soul had been audited and found wanting. "My grandmother didn't just watch you, Mark, she analyzed you. She knew your firm was a Ponzi scheme built on the backs of honest laborers. If you file a single motion in the divorce court, if you so much as speak my name to a journalist, this folder goes to the federal prosecutor. You won't be looking for a maintenance allowance. You'll be looking for a way to survive 20 years in a maximum security cell." The silence in the room was absolute. Mark's lawyer looked at the folder, then at his client, and slowly closed his briefcase. "We're done here," the lawyer whispered. Mark didn't say a word. He didn't even look at me as he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving his garbage bags of pride behind. He signed the no-fault, no-asset divorce papers an hour later. He vanished from the city within the week, a bad debt finally written off the Vance books forever. I didn't just go back to Ozyorny. I used the Vance Trust to buy the top floor of the building where I used to be a clerk. I opened Vance Forensic Services. I didn't market to corporations. I marketed to women. Women like the ones Martha had helped in her secret underground railroad. I helped them audit the men who were trying to gaslight them out of their inheritance. I helped them find the hidden assets, the secret deeds, and the buyer's gaze before the locks were changed. And I hired Sarah. My former coworker, the one who had watched me being dragged from the store by my arm, found me 6 months later. She was working 3 jobs, her eyes hollow with the same deficit of life that I had once known. "You're senior auditor now, I heard," she said, standing in my glass-walled office. "I am," I said. I handed her a navy blue blazer and a ledger. "Welcome to the firm, Sarah. We're starting an audit on your life today. We're moving you into the asset column." 3 years later, the sun was setting over the lake in Ozyorny. The timber house stood tall against the darkening sky, the windows glowing with a warm amber light. I was sitting on the porch, a thick green leather ledger open on my lap. Next to me, sitting on a hand-woven rug, was a little girl. She was 4 years old, her hair a wild tangle of dark curls, her eyes sharp and observant as she sorted a pile of colored stones into neat, even rows. "One for the house, one for the forest, one for the lake," she murmured, her voice a tiny echo of a cadence I had heard all my life. "That's a very balanced system, Vera," I said, smoothing her hair. I had named her Vera, Truth. I looked at the old photograph on the mantel inside, visible through the open door. It was Martha. She was standing in the manufacturing plant, her hand resting on a massive ledger, her eyes looking straight into the camera as if she were auditing the future itself. I realized then that Martha hadn't just saved me from Mark, she had given me a new architecture for my soul. She had taught me that love isn't a vulnerability to be exploited, it is the most valuable capital we possess. But like all capital, it must be protected by internal controls. It must be audited. It must be guarded by a superior paper trail. I picked up my pen and opened Vera's ledger. It was a new one, bound in soft emerald green leather. On the first page, I didn't write a poem or a wish for her to be a princess. I didn't want her to be a princess. I wanted her to be an auditor. I wrote, "Vance Legacy, Generation 4, Opening Balance, Unconditional Love, Liabilities, 0, Internal Controls, Active, Mission Statement, The Vance women never sleep in the rain." I looked up as the first stars began to pierce the velvet dark above the pines. I felt the weight of the house behind me, the weight of the forest around me, and the weight of the silver and ink in my blood. The world would always be full of men with buyers' gazes. The market would always fluctuate. Predators would always wait for the rain to fall. But as I watched Vera sort her stones, I knew the balance was correct. The columns were straight. The interest was compounding. "Elena,"
a voice called from inside. It was Liam, the man who had helped me find the peace I hadn't known I deserved, a man who had never looked at the ceiling, only ever at me. "The tea is ready, and the audit of the garden plans is complete." I smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached all the way to my marrow. "Coming," I said. I closed the green ledger. The steel ledger of the Vance family was safe. We were in the black. We were home. And as the wind sighed through the ancient cedars, I knew that Martha Vance was finally, at long last, satisfied with the closing entry.
A new story will be published here in just a couple of days. Don't miss it.